Hello, this is Fred Haight speaking, and welcome to Part 2 of Dvorak's fight to save the soul of the United States. Part 1 discussed the war that went on over Dvorak's visit here and the intent of his visit here. Part 2 will discuss the war that actually takes place in the symphony itself. Perhaps some of my listeners have undergone a sort of epiphany upon hearing a particularly great performance of a certain work. For example, the first time I heard Willem Furtwängler conduct Schubert's Ninth Symphony, it was as though hearing the work for the first time. Sometimes such an epiphany can increase not just your respect for the particular work, but for the composer. Such an eye-opener for me was hearing Dvorak's New World Symphony performed by Václav Talach and the Czech Philharmonic from the 1954 recording. I had long had a great appreciation and respect for what Dvorak did while here. However, that was colored somewhat by my thinking of him as a very good composer, but not among the greatest of composers. Hearing Talach conduct the New World Symphony and many other works as well helped me understand why Brahms had such high regard for Dvorak as a composer. Brahms encouraged many composers, that's just the type of man he was, but often showed only mild interest in their music. But Dvorak is the only one who he held in such high regard, and even went so far as to say, "This fellow has more ideas than any of us." I am going to introduce you to Talach, and perhaps even introduce you to a new idea of Dvorak, by doing something I dearly love to do, make a comparison of excerpts. Here is the beginning of the fourth movement of the New World Symphony. It is conducted by Otto Klemperer, a very famous 20th century conductor. Now, let's listen to the same opening as performed by Václav Talach. Who was Václav Talach? As a boy, he met Dvorak, and Dvorak personally sponsored his musical studies. He was a violinist who played in string quartets all of his life and served for a while as the concertmaster of the Berlin Philharmonic under the great Arthur Nikisch. He was so inspired by Nikisch that he decided to become a conductor and studied conducting with that master. His protégés included such great conductors as Raphael Kubelik, Karl Ancherl, and Václav Neumann. Why then have you not heard of him? Well, first of all, he was conductor of the Czech Philharmonic when the Nazis invaded, and they made every effort to co-opt him as one of their own. Though it's pretty clear that he resisted the Nazis in every way possible, he was put on trial at the end of the war. He was, however, exonerated, as was Furtwängler. When the communists took power in Czechoslovakia a few years later, they didn't care if he'd been exonerated. They just simply said, "You're a Nazi collaborator," and they put him in jail. There was an outpouring, a protest across the country from people who knew what a patriot he really was. So he was released from jail, but he was never allowed to conduct the Czech Philharmonic in public again. He made a handful of recordings, and as a result, there are only a few recordings by him extant today. Tallis was only fully exonerated in the early 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union. Yet, from those handful of recordings, I regard him as one of the great conductors of the 20th century. His performances of Mozart and Bach do not pale when listened to against such greats as Furtwängler or Casals. Ironically, it would seem that one of Dvorak's fellow Czechs had a better understanding, at least as demonstrated in his performances, of what Dvorak was doing in the United States than most American conductors do. Subtitle: The New World Symphony. It was Mrs. Thurber's idea that Dvorak compose a new symphony while in the United States and entitle it From the New World. She also had a great deal of input into many of the ideas that went into that symphony. Before we begin to look at the symphony itself, I wish to read to you a review that took place the day after its performance. It was written by Henry Krabbeil, who was a close collaborator of both Dvorak and Jeanette Thurber, and published in the New York Tribune. It again gives you an idea of the controversy that raged both before and after. Quote, "There is an old story which seems apposite in view of the production of Dr. Dvorak's new symphony at the Philharmonic concert last night. Once upon a time, a conjurer in words came to Diogenes, and sitting in his tub argued volubly against the existence of motion. The philosopher said nothing, but quietly arose, and while the sophist argued and demonstrated to his own satisfaction that there was no such thing as motion, he walked up and down in front of the talker. A great deal of printer's ink has been wasted during the last 6 months in arguing that American music was a mere vagary. Some, sitting in their tubs of self-satisfied wisdom, have asserted that all good music is universal and nationalism a figment of the imagination. Others have urged that Dr. Dvorak, in urging young American composers to go to the folk song melodies, which have grown up in America for inspiration, was trying to make a place for nigger symphonies. Others, again, for they were many and so were their minds, denied that the stamp of American nationalism could be impressed upon music in the classical forms by the use of these melodies, for the reason that they were not native. But while these wise men were talking, Dr. Dvorak was listening with ears of genius, and before they got through, he had written his new symphony. They talked like the sophists, and he walked like Diogenes." That's once again Henry Krabbeil writing in the New York Tribune after the premiere of Dvorak's New World Symphony. What did Krabbeil hear in this music that in his mind made it so resoundingly successful as American music? Krabbeil was not just a critic. He was a collaborator of Dvorak and Thurber, was quite musically educated himself, and in fact did a lot of research himself into Native American music. Dvorak did not look at African American spirituals and Native American music as completely hermetically sealed and separated things. He sought for commonalities among them. It's well known that he found such a commonality in the pentatonic scale, that is a scale featuring 5 rather than 7 notes, but he also found a rhythmic commonality known as the Scottish snap. A Scottish snap is a short syncopated phrase of 2 notes, consisting of a 16th note followed by a dotted 8th. That means there's a total of 4 16th notes. So if you count in 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, it would go like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, da da, da da. It's very common in the music of the Plains Indians, such as the Cheyenne. Here's a short excerpt from an Apache war dance which begins with a slightly altered Scotch snap.
Hey na, ho-ay-ya, hey-na-yo, hey-na-yo, hey na, ho-ay-ya, hey-na-yo, hey-ya, hey-ya, hey-na-yo, ho-ay-ya, hey-ya, hey-ya, hey-na-yo, hey-ya.
Dvorak is reported to have said repeatedly that he found similarities of both Native American music and the plantation spirituals with Scottish music, including both the Scotch snap rhythm and the pentatonic scale. The Scottish snap, however, can also be an inversion or mirror image of itself, just as your left hand is a mirror image of your right hand. So that mirror image would be a dotted eighth followed by a 16th note. Let me count once again. 1, 2, 3, 4. Da, 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 da. That rhythm by itself would not necessarily constitute a Scottish snap. It's a very common rhythm. When, however, it accompanies the Scottish snap, then it is heard as the inversion or mirror image of that Scottish snap. When we put the two of them together, we get 1, 2, 3, 4. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 da. A great example of a Scottish snap combining with its inversion is, as you might expect, a Scottish song, a setting of a Robert Burns poem. Can a buddy meet a buddy coming through the rye? Dvorak found this Scottish snap rhythm as a point of commonality between Native American music and plantation spirituals. Listen now to this beautiful spiritual and see if you can hear in it not only that Scottish snap, but its combination with its own mirror image, as we heard in Coming Through the Rye.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home.
Perhaps you can hear how that single word chariot has exactly the same metrical characteristics as can a body meet a body. Let me count it though. 1, 2, 3, 4. Chariot. Can a body meet a body? Chariot. Perhaps an idea has been brewing in your preconscious. I will now play for you the first theme from the first movement of the New World Symphony, which follows a short introduction. And after all we've gone through, you may find a light going on in your head. But let me precede that first theme with these. Chariot, can a body? So, Dvorak, without quoting either Negro spirituals or Native American music, has managed to create something that sounds American because he found this commonality of rhythm. And it reminds me of something. When he spent the summer in Spillville, Iowa, a Czech community, he would sit down at the organ and play Czech folk songs, of which he knew hundreds, for his fellow Czechs. Many of the folk songs were ones that his fellow Czechs had never heard before. They were long forgotten, and yet they were moved to tears. Dvorak insisted that there were certain qualities and characteristics to a nation's music that, when invoked, would move people even if they had never heard the work before. Some of these characteristics of a national music have a lot to do with language. You won't find many Scotch snaps in Italian opera or German lieder because it's not part of the spoken language. You may recall from part 1 that the New York Tribune claimed to have a special correspondent in Europe who interviewed many famous musicians, including Joseph Joachim. If there's any veracity to that claim, then Joachim is reported to have advised Dvorak that it were better not to quote too many American themes directly, but to capture the local color. That's a profound idea if you understand local color not as just picture painting, but getting to the heart of a nation's music and language. In fact, that's what Dvorak did in Bohemia. He did not quote a lot of Bohemian themes directly, but developed a Bohemian characteristic and quality throughout the music. That first theme segues into a second theme, which is not as important as the first or third themes, but it again invokes a certain quality. I can think of many songs, Jimmy Cracked Corn, Turkey in the Straw, especially Get Out the Way, Old Man Tucker, but also, I'm sure, many plantation hoedowns that I'm just not familiar with. Hoedown, by the way, was the end of the day when you stop working and put the hoe down. But it invokes them without quoting any of them. It's in G minor and it features the flat seventh. And Harry Burleigh wrote that he was convinced that Dvorak took this from the spirituals. Burleigh would often sing a spiritual with a flat seventh in it, and Dvorak would ask him, "Is that how the slaves sing it, Burleigh?" But Dvorak is not going to leave it at that. He's not just going to invoke the flavor. It's an important part of it. But the third theme is the one that caused such a furor, such a controversy. So let's just play it and see if you can figure out what freaked people out so much about this simple flute solo. Some of you may have noticed that that bears a particular resemblance to Swing Low's Sweet Chariot, especially starting on the word chariot. Just that part.
Chariot, coming for to carry me home.
And the third theme is Ba-da-da-dum, da-da-da-da-dum. So that's pretty clear, although the nature of it is changed. But the way in which the nature of it is changed is consistent with the meaning of the song itself. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot is widely recognized to be one of the code songs for the Underground Railroad. Slaves escaping their bondage in southern plantations needed guidance on the way north. Along the pathway of the Underground Railroad, quilts were often hung on clotheslines that had clues knitted into them in code. And there were also many spirituals that had hidden meanings to guide the escapees in the Underground Railroad. The most famous code song was Follow the Drinking Gourd referring to the Big Dipper, and how to locate the North Star from the Big Dipper as a constant guide north. Swing Low is also such a code song. The chariot does refer to the biblical reference, the obvious biblical reference of the chariot taking Elijah to heaven, but there's a secondary, more profound meaning to it. The chariot being the Underground Railroad, the band of angels coming after me referring to the workers of the Underground Railroad, and coming forward to carry me home referring to the promised freedom north of the border. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was the favorite spiritual of Harriet Tubman, the leader of the Underground Railroad, and her associates often substituted the words Swing Low, Sweet Harriet. Now, put together several established facts in your mind. 1. Burley reported how much Dvorak loved, in particular, this song, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. 2. The song is recognized to be a code song for the Underground Railroad. 3. Burley recalls Dvorak's countless demands to inform him not just of the music of his people, but of the struggles of his people. And 4, that Burley's family was heavily involved with the Underground Railroad in Erie, Pennsylvania. How unlikely is it that Burley would not have informed Dvorak of that code meaning of this song? I will submit to you that given all that evidence, and given what we know about Dvorak's revolutionary nature, his temperament would have led him to identify more with the Underground Railroad meaning of that spiritual than the seemingly more passive idea of Elijah going to heaven. There was a performance of the symphony in 1911 in Philadelphia, and with the program came an article entitled, quote, Henry, T. Burley's contribution to the discussion of the New World Symphony. Let me read a bit of that to you. Burley, it is reported, had more to do with determining the character of the melodies in the New World Symphony than any other person in America, because he was there at the National Conservatory while Dvorak was the head of affairs, and it was largely through Burley that Dvorak became acquainted with the melancholy beauty of the Negro spirituals. Mr. Burley, after recently having been asked to give his version of his experiences for this publication, noted that there is a tendency these days to ignore the Negro elements in the New World Symphony, shown by the fact that many of those who were able in 1893 to find traces of Negro musical color all through the symphony now cannot find anything in the whole 4 movements that suggest any local or Negro influence. Though there is no doubt at all that Dr. Dvorak was deeply impressed by the old Negro spirituals and also by the Foster songs. That's a quote from Burley. Burley continues, It was my privilege to repeatedly sing some of the old plantation songs for him at his home in East 17th Street, and one in particular, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, greatly pleased him. And part of this old spiritual will be found in the second theme of the first movement of the symphony. It is in G major, and it is given out by the flute. At Burley's suggestion, the musical notes for the spiritual and the musical notes for that theme in the symphony were printed right next to each other in that program. He calls it the second theme, I call it the third. We're talking about the same thing. Burley continues, the similarity is so evident that it doesn't even need to be heard. The eye can see it. Dvorak just saturated himself with the spirit of these old tunes and then invented his own themes. I have never been publicly credited with exerting any influence upon Dr. Dvorak, although it is tacitly believed that there isn't much doubt about it, for I was with him almost constantly, and he loved to hear me sing the old melodies. Walter Damrosch, the assistant conductor of the New York Philharmonic, once alluded to my having brought these songs to Dvorak's attention, but there was so much discussion and difference of opinion as to the value of the intimation that in the songs of the Negroes lay the basis for a national school of music, and the controversy waxed so hot that all reference to the source of his information was lost. That, again, is a series of quotes from Harry Burley as published in the program notes of a performance of the New World Symphony in Philadelphia in the year 1911. Let us return to the first movement of the symphony. The first theme is based on the Scottish snap and its inversion. The third theme opens up with the word chariot, which is also based on the Scottish snap and its inversion. Chariot. These two themes begin to combine in a miraculous way, and as you might expect, it can be a little bit difficult sometimes to determine which one you're listening to. As well, the single four-note motif on the word chariot begins to develop and be repeated by itself. It will play a key guiding role throughout the symphony. Listen to the way in which these ideas combine and intertwine. The movement ends on a strong but unresolved note. The second movement, as is often the case in a symphony, comes from a completely different direction and would seem to have almost nothing to do with what we've heard before. Let's listen to the opening measures. Okay, so what is this music all about? On the one hand, Dvorak's sons under pressure said, "Oh yes, you can hear how homesick and lonely our father was. You can hear it in those opening 7 chords of the second movement." And even one of Dvorak's students, William Arms Fisher, in 1922, went so far as to take that lovely solo for the English horn and set it to words as a song or quasi-spiritual entitled "Goin' Home," once again reflecting the homesickness of the composer. This song, "Goin' Home," has become so well known that many people today believe that Dvorak based the theme for this movement of the symphony on that song when it was actually the other way around. Thus, the movement has come to epitomize Dvorak's homesickness. I must say a word about this now. Was Dvorak homesick? Was he totally immune to any feelings of missing his native land? Of course he wasn't. Of course he missed his native land. Not in a sickly way. He was a Czech patriot, involved in making a revolution, involved in building a natural culture. And he had studied and thought about his own culture in an unprecedented way. How could he not miss that? The lie consists in saying that his homesickness was of such a sickly and debilitating nature that it made him impotent to accomplish anything positive in the United States. The opposite is true. The same revolutionary fervor that fed his work in his native Czechia fed him in the United States. So, what is the second movement really all about? We don't have to guess. We have ample evidence. Dvorak, while in his native Bohemia, had read a Czech translation of Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. Mrs. Thurber encouraged him to make either an opera or an oratorio out of the Song of Hiawatha, and Dvorak freely admitted that the entire second movement of the symphony was born out of that plan, and that the main theme of the third movement also came from a representation of a scene in the Song of Hiawatha. You may recall me mentioning before that Dvorak found a point of commonality between plantation spirituals and Native American music in the pentatonic scale, a scale which features 5 rather than 7 notes. Here, that is put to particularly beautiful use. The main theme, as stated in the cor anglais, a lower form of oboe, corresponds loosely to a pentatonic scale. In fact, so much so that that theme can be played perfectly on a Native American flute. I've done it myself. I don't have the flute with me, so I'll let you listen to someone else playing it. There is another input, though, into this. Dvorak remarked that the quality of the English horn reminded him of Burleigh's voice. And many people have noticed the similarity between the theme, this main theme that we just heard on the flute of the second movement, and the spiritual Deep River. So let's listen for just a minute to Paul Robeson singing Deep River. He continues, though, with music that could not possibly be played on the Native American flute. In one of the quotes attributed to him, Dvorak is reported to have said that he would find and discover every beauty in American music that he could, but at the same time, he would bring in the full cavalry of Western resources, of orchestration, of counterpoint and harmony to both transform and uplift that beautiful music. Let us return to the subject of Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. Who was Hiawatha? The Iroquois were not so much a tribe, but a league among at first five and then six different nations. And Hiawatha was a legendary leader, a prophet sent unto them to unify the tribes and overcome their fratricidal tendencies. In Longfellow's poem, Hiawatha decides to marry Minnehaha from the far-off land of the Dakota tribe. When his father warns him not to marry a Dakota, they're the enemy, Hiawatha insists that that's precisely one of the reasons why he is going to marry her. Under those first 7 chords, which his sons were pressured into saying represented homesickness, he wrote in his sketches the words, "The birth of a legend." Does that sound like a homesick notion to you? The legend to which he refers is, of course, Hiawatha. Let's listen to just that opening one more time. Let me read to you the first few verses of Longfellow's poem, The Song of Hiawatha, but preface it by saying that I don't know much about the poem. It gets trashed a lot these days. Ethnographers are very quick to jump on what they consider mistakes to have been made. But as far as I can see, Longfellow's efforts and the people that he worked with, like Henry Rowe Schoolcraft and an Ojibwe Indian chief, Longfellow was making one of the first serious attempts to actually study Native American culture, a real Native American culture. And of course you're going to make mistakes the first time you try to do that. But Longfellow insisted that he could back up every term, name, or legend cited as authentic and regarded it as one of the first great stories written about an American idea and history rather than a European one. I will now read a few lines from near the beginning of the poem, and I will try to avoid the skills and charybda of the usual sing-song approach by the shores of Gitchigumi, and the other side, which is just blank verse, like prose, and read it with some attempt at the trochaic tetrameter, the rhythm with which Longfellow used it, which he and others claim represented very well the speech patterns of several of the Native American nations. In this scene, Gitche Manitou, the creator, has called together the warriors of all the different tribes or nations. And they stood there on the meadow with their weapons and their war gear, painted like the leaves of autumn, painted like the sky of morning, wildly glaring at each other, in their faces stern defiance, in their hearts the feuds of ages, the hereditary hatred, the ancestral thirst of vengeance. Gitche Manitou, the mighty, the creator of the nations, looked upon them with compassion, with paternal love and pity, looked upon their wrath and wrangling but as quarrels among children, but as feuds and fights of children. Over them he stretched his right hand to subdue their stubborn natures, to allay their thirst and fever. By the shadow of his right hand spake to them with voice majestic, as the sound of far-off waters falling into deep abysses. Warning, chiding, spake in this wise, O my children, my poor children, listen to the words of wisdom, listen to the words of warning from the lips of the Great Spirit, from the master of life who made you. I have given you lands to hunt in. I have given you streams to fish in. I have given you bear and bison. I have given you roe and reindeer. I have given you brant and beaver, filled the marshes full of wildfowl, filled the rivers full of fishes. Why then are you not contented? Why then will you hunt each other? I am weary of your quarrels, weary of your wars and bloodshed, weary of your prayers for vengeance, of your wranglings and dissensions. All your strength is in your union. All your danger is in discord. Therefore, be at peace henceforward, and as brothers live together. I will send a prophet to you, a deliverer of the nations, who shall guide you and shall teach you, who shall toil and suffer with you. If you listen to his counsels, you will multiply and prosper. If his warnings pass unheeded, you will fade away and perish. Bathe now in the stream before you. Wash the war pant from your faces. Wash the blood stains from your fingers. Bury your war clubs and your weapons. Break the redstone from this quarry. Mold and make it into peace pipes. Take the reeds that grow beside you. Deck them with your brightest feathers. Smoke the calumet together, and as brothers live henceforward. Whatever you may think of the poem, I hope you can see what Dvorak saw in it. The reason he sought commonalities among different forms of music is because he was an apostle of the unifying, not just observing things as they are, but changing them to bring about a unity that did not exist before, and the commonalities are merely the means to accomplish that. Hiawatha was a prophet involved in bringing about such a unity among the Native American nations, and as we shall see later in this movement, Dvorak musically begins to unify the cause of both the Native American people and the African American people. Dvorak acknowledged that certain sections of the second movement in particular represented scenes from the Song of Hiawatha, such as the death of Minnehaha. I don't think it's helpful to get too literal about that, but I will point out one thing. He was a master of orchestration. He always knew which instrument to use, and he told his students what could be more funereal than the lower register of the clarinets. Listen to the following section from the second movement, which does represent the death of Minnehaha, and while you will hear the main melody carried in the strings, listen carefully to what the low registers of the clarinets are doing beneath it. However, immediately following this section, something miraculous happens that may remind you of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony. It's as though it were an intervention from the outside, offering hope. Listen to it, please, and listen closely, and see how many different things you can hear going on in this section. At a key point, you will hear the violas and cellos play. That is a transformation of the first theme from the first movement. Change to. You will hear that answered by the horns, which is a very clear transition of the main theme of the second movement. The first two notes of that theme, by the way, are a dotted eighth note followed by a 16th, which you may recall from the first movement is the inversion or mirror image of the Scottish snap. By itself, it doesn't constitute a Scottish snap. It's too common a rhythm. But Dvorak uses it here. It combines very, very well with the rhythms established in the first movement. So, these trombones and horns combine like this. Listen to what the first and second violins are doing at the same time. Is not that the single word chariot from Swing Low, Sweet Chariot? Swing low, sweet chariot, 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 chariot. Now we have three themes combining in a poetic and beautiful and hopeful way. And we begin to discover that that single word chariot and everything that was associated with it, the Scottish snap, its inversion, the Underground Railroad, the relationship to the first subject, there's a reason why that four-note motif chariot is the guiding sign throughout the entire symphony. At this point, some critics may say, well, gosh, Fred, you're reading an awful lot into this. My answer is, give me another explanation. Let's listen again to just a shorter part of that key section and tell me that it's an accident the way these themes combine. From this point, the movement continues to the end in sublime beauty. The third movement begins again from a completely different place. You can't look at this movement without realizing that there are several inputs into it. Dvorak acknowledged that in the opening of the third movement, he wished to depict the dancing of the Indians is described in Hiawatha. There's only one place where that takes place. It's the dance by Pau Puk Kiwis, a man of questionable character, at the wedding of Hiawatha and Minnehaha. Let me read a bit of it, the description of that dance to you. First he danced a solemn measure, very slow in step and gesture, in and out among the pine trees, through the shadows and the sunshine, treading softly like a panther. Then more swiftly, and still swifter, whirling, spinning round in circles, leaping o'er the guests assembled, eddying round and round the wigwam, till the leaves went whirling with him, till the dust and wind together swept in eddies round about him. Then along the sandy margin of the lake, the big sea water, on he sped with frenzied gestures, stamped upon the ground, and tossed it wildly in the air around him, till the wind became a whirlwind, till the sand was blown and sifted like the great snow drifts o'er the landscape, heaping all the shores with sand dunes. Think of that image of such a frenzied dance that it creates a whirlwind of leaves and sand with it, and a whirlwind of increasing intensity. And listen to this section again. But what about input from actual Native American music? You will read time and time again, largely from ethnologists, that no such thing exists. Dvorak spent the summer of 1893 in the Czech community of Spillville, Iowa. While there, he convened daily musical councils, including of visiting Iroquois musicians. Yet the all-knowing ethnologist will argue that he had already finished the symphony in New York and that it was just simply too late for him to add what he learned there, blithely ignoring two things. One, a Czech compatriot of Dvorak had made a visit to the United States earlier and published a book back in Bohemia of Native American tunes, so Dvorak had already studied Native American music before he even set foot in the United States. And two, as to the business that he'd already finished the symphony, he had the symphony with him in Spillville and was constantly editing and revising it. One Dvorak scholar, Jarmil Berghauser, got it right when he said, "What takes forever for the pedant to understand crosses the mind of genius in a flash." Who knows how much the symphony changed during his visit to Spillville, Iowa. I might add that Dvorak's close friend, the great composer Johannes Brahms, made an astounding offer to do the corrections for publications of the New World Symphony and other works written by Dvorak in America, a task usually reserved for a mere copyist. When Brahms and Dvorak together attended the Vienna premiere of the New World Symphony, Brahms could respond to critics that he had the piece memorized, and despite certain criticisms he might have, found it, as it stands, so unspeakably gifted, so healthy, that one must rejoice in it. Let us return to the subject of Native American input. I have no training in ethnology whatsoever. I'm simply going to present a couple of interesting things that I discovered. Here is a score for an Iroquois war dance. I set it to software. Compare that to the main theme of the third movement. A third input comes from music that purports to be authentic Iroquois music, and I see no reason to doubt it. It's a dance called Standing Quiver, as performed by Art and Lyle. Folk music will quite naturally find classical principles. And while this music is interesting for being rhythmically complex, what I find more interesting is the quality of antiphony. Antiphony is when a second voice answers a first voice with almost the same notes, they're just altered slightly for cadential purposes. It's a kind of call and response. Now, listen to exactly that quality of antiphony in the main theme of the third movement. There's another input. In most of the Native American music that I have listened to, while the vocal line might be quite rhythmically complex, the drums are steady, emphasizing every beat. That was the case in the piece we just heard by Arden Lyle. And in Dvorak's movement, the strings fill exactly that role. They imitate the drums. Now, please listen to that again and tell me whether it's in 3/4 time or 4/4 time. Dvorak marked it 3/4, but you can also hear 4/4 in it, especially in the way that these strings imitate the drums. Native American music often combines a 4/4 time in the drums with a 3/4 or 6/8 time in the singing. You can hear it in this Apache war song, although technically the drums are not in 4/4, each drum beat represents a dotted quarter, thus 4 drum beats for every 2 measures in 6/8, and you can also hear an altered version of the Scotch snap in it. So now we have several different inputs from Longfellow's Hiawatha, from Iroquois music, from Apache music, and there is yet another input which is not really Native American. That was the opening of the scherzo movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. Now, listen to, once again, the opening of the scherzo movement of Dvorak's Ninth Symphony. Talk about bringing in the cavalry. Dvorak had the good sense, when someone gave him a wreath entitled "To the World's Greatest Composer," to hang it over his bust of Beethoven. For the second movement, Dvorak described more than one scene drawn from the Song of Hiawatha. For the third, he described only the opening, the dancing of the Indians. The movement has 2 other dances in it which are much happier than the opening war dance. This has caused some biographers to search around the Song of Hiawatha, trying to find a passage that might correspond to these happier dances. Other biographers have written it off as simply bohemian music with no American input whatsoever. I don't think either one is quite true. This is a case, I believe, where the musical transformation in itself as music can give you the idea. In the transition to what would normally be called the trio section of a scherzo movement, Dvorak employs the first theme of the first movement, but not in its usual exuberant, aggressive way. It's more questioning, as though looking for something. Here is that transition in the actual symphony. This section also contains an unmistakable musical reference to birds, which was a very happy subject, both for Native Americans and Dvorak personally. At this point, I must make a short interjection. I have said before that at the time it was denied that there was any American content to this symphony at all. Many of you may object and say, well, I hear American things in it. I get images of open spaces, Grand Teton, driving the cattle along, wagon trains moving west, that kind of thing. Please listen to another theme from this, the third movement, and see if it does not invoke some of those images for you. Now, please listen to this. That was the theme song for a very famous Western cowboy movie, and if you compare it to what we just listened to from the New World Symphony before it, I think you would have to acknowledge, to be kind, that it's somewhat indebted to the Dvorak. Now you have a whole other problem in understanding the New World Symphony. You have associations with it which are post facto. Cowboy movies are post facto. There were no movies in Dvorak's time, so these associations could not possibly have existed at this time. Yet, the New World Symphony has been used and abused so many times by Hollywood that you're going to have these post facto mappings onto it. The New World Symphony is American music, but not movie music in the way that most people would hear it as American music. Let us return to the progression of the symphony as a whole. This movement ends as follows. Or at least that's how you might expect it to end. Dvorak adds a very short but amazing coda at the end of the movement. Let's listen again. Okay, what's going on here? The trumpets play the first theme of the first movement. That's answered by this. And the flutes and oboes. What is that? That's pretty clearly just the opening two tones of the main theme of this, the third movement. Shorten to this. That keeps rising. Until the trombone suddenly plays this. Which is what? That's the third theme of the first movement, which is based on Chariot, come to carry me home. So now we've had the word chariot in all three movements so far, and here we have the entire theme quoted again at the end. And tell me that Dvorak is not seeing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot in the Underground Railroad sense of a code song, of something guiding us towards freedom. This coda strikes me as an intervention from the outside, like the part in the second movement that we identified where all of these themes combined, and to me it strengthens my argument about what Dvorak is doing. Even if you could explain that intervention in the second movement as being purely by chance, by accident, can you explain him doing it twice? While the trombones sing that third theme from the first movement based on Chariot, Comin' for to Carry Me Home, we still hear from this movement the war dance theme. So both the music of and the causes of the former slaves and the Native Americans are wedded. And now we come to the final movement, the fourth movement of the symphony, the grand finale. I have heard it described as the weakest movement in the symphony. That could only have been said by someone who had not looked at it closely at all. It's the strongest movement. It has to be. It's the grand finale. The movement is marked Allegro con fuoco, which means Allegro with fire. After a brief introduction, the main theme, which I call Dvorak's war cry, is stated. That main theme, the one I call the war cry, is then repeated, but with the addition of a trumpet. This addition of a trumpet is often underplayed. Polish really makes it stand out. I'm going to back up and start again with the original statement so you can hear the difference when the repeat with the trumpet comes in. Why do I insist on a warlike interpretation of this movement, besides the warlike nature of the music itself? I believe that the Civil War and the freeing of the slaves loomed large in Dvorak's mind. I'm going to read you the last paragraph of the last interview that he gave in the United States in Harper's Weekly. It was during the end of his second visit in 1895, so he spoke English much better than he did when he arrived. And when music has been established as one of the reigning arts of the land, another wreath of fame and glory will be added to this country, which earned its name the Land of Freedom by unshackling her slaves at the price of her own blood. That again is from an interview by Harper's Weekly with Antonin Dvorak in 1895. Let's again compare Otto Klemperer to Václav Talas. In Klemperer's version, you can hardly tell that these flourishes in the strings imitate a trumpet charge, and to my mind suggest an impending charge. Where, as in Talas's recording, they definitely sound like much more like a trumpet charge. Klemperer then makes the common mistake of a retard before going into the forte section, and during this forte section he emphasizes the strings, which can even sound a little bit like chickens clucking. Talas treats this transition much more as though it were a military charge, and of course you don't want to hesitate or retard before you charge. You want to go straight into it, and he emphasizes the brass much more than the strings. Listen to the difference. As we proceed through the movement, we find Dvorak combining all of the major themes that he has developed in the symphony so far in the most miraculous way. I'm going to identify some of them for you, but I want to point out that it's not to demonstrate Dvorak's brilliance, although he did do this very brilliantly. Neither is it for us to give ourselves self-congratulatory pats on the back for our own cleverness in identifying these themes. Rather, it is to identify a sense of dynamic change that subsumes both the themes and the transformation of the themes. We have a tremendous sense of a motion forward, as though looking and moving and fighting for a solution to the problem. So let's move on a little bit in the symphony and ask yourself what you are listening to here. Okay, the main theme of this movement, which I call Dvorak's War Cry, goes as follows. You can hear that the brass are doing basically that. Then the cellos and contrabasses come in with this, which is a diminution or sped up version of the first half of that theme. Then the strings play. The original theme centers around notes above E and below it. Which brings it into an unusual and perhaps not obvious correspondence with the opening of the second movement of the Fourth Symphony, also in E minor, by his friend Johannes Brahms. The triplet figuration in this, the fourth movement, also rises above and below and comes back to E in a similar way. Can't you hear that as a sped up version of this? So you got the main theme at 3 different speeds. In original tempo, in diminution, and double diminution in triplets. That sounds technical, confusing, even boring, doesn't it? Look at it another way. The theme has entered into a dialogue with itself, or rather, a dialogue with its own process of transformation. And, as in any process of transformation that any human being goes through, you have very specific reference points. It's not nebulous dialogue with everything you've ever done. It's a dialogue with specific points of change. Now, 2 old friends, themes from other movements, join in the dialogue. I am sure that you will recognize this in the woodwinds as a transformation of this from the second movement. And this in the first violins as a transformation of the main theme of the third movement. But what's this going on in the violas? that a transformation of Henry Krobel, however, also saw it as a sly transformation of Yankee Doodle. A bit later, the first theme from the first movement joins in the fun. Now we come to one of the most sublime moments in the entire symphony. I made a comparison before between Klemperer and Tallisch in the transition, where the cellos sound like they are sounding the motif, the charge motif, and in Tallisch's case we go into what actually sounds like a charge. The same thing happens again, only this time the roles are reversed. It's the woodwinds carrying the charge motif and the strings playing the melody. But Tallisch builds you up to expect that same powerful forte charge, but what happens is that exactly the same melody is played, but very soft and tender, as though envisioning a time after war when a hard-won peace might be obtained. And it can only remind me of Schiller's notion of energizing beauty and melting beauty, and the miracle obtained when the same theme can be played both as energizing beauty and as melting beauty. I know of no one else who captures this like Tallisch. I've compared many conductors. The two sections are minutes apart. It takes a tremendous sense of structure on the part of the conductor to capture that change of what you might expect from what you've heard before to hearing that same process of change turned into something sublime. You have to have the tempo exactly right. You have to have the transition exactly right. And I'm reminded of something that Tallisch said about lousy conductors. He said, it's a good thing for these conductors that music is made out of notes rather than material things, because if music were made of material things, their own constructions would cave in, fall in on their heads, and crush them. So in order to get this, I'm going to play those two sections in their entirety. I'll go back and play what you've heard before, just to help you appreciate the difference. And now here is Tallisch's own miraculous transformation of that transition over 200 measures later in the movement. I will assume that I have listeners at all different levels of development, and as a teacher, I wish to bring everybody along. I can remember in my student days how difficult it was to assimilate the subtleties of classical music. So I will contrast just that charge theme, both as a charge and something tender. And over 200 measures later, in another point of refinement, as in looking at a jewel under a microscope, please compare this with this. The one thing we have yet to hear in this fourth movement is that four-note theme on the word chariot, that four-note motif. Could there be a better place for it than this? Listen to the horn solo, which follows immediately after what we have just listened to. Now I'll play the next section, and this time I'm not going to identify the themes for you. You should be able to do that for yourself. I will only add that the one thing that we haven't heard for a while is the 7 chords that opened up the second movement, the chords under which Dvorak wrote the words, "The Birth of a Legend." Those 7 chords, however, are now energized. Dvorak ends the symphony with the most incredible tension and dissonance between the main theme of the first movement and the main theme of the fourth movement. See if you can hear it. Is it any wonder that the racist oligarchy went apeshit over this symphony? They couldn't attack the music or attack Dvorak as a composer. He was too good. So they came up with the scurrilous racist attacks that you heard in part one. But what really freaked them out about it? I believe in a way it backs up something said by Abraham Lincoln, that this nation was founded upon a proposition that all men are created equal. How do you make that real, though? You can repeat it as many times you want to someone who doesn't believe it, and you're not going to change their minds. But if you can take the music, the most primitive music of the most supposedly primitive people, and find in it something human, something universal, something that through bringing in the full cavalry of Western resources could transform it into anything as beautiful as anything in the world, then you have accomplished something. Then you have presented a proof. Now, for the last word, what about the aftermath of Dvorak's visit? That's a subject interesting enough that it could take another third installment over an hour long, and we just don't have time for it. Maybe another day. And I would wish the help of several trusted friends and colleagues in pursuing that. Suffice it to say for now that you cannot separate what happened to Dvorak's work here from what happened in the way that music was going in the world, the way that art was going in the world, the way that political developments were going. In other words, you can't separate it from the general downward spiral which civilization took into the early 20th century. So with that, I will say goodbye for now, and close in mentioning that there are organizations such as the Foundation for the Revival of Classical Culture, organizations and individuals who are heroically fighting to revive classical culture, and I can think of no better place to start than Antonin Dvorak's mission to the United States of America.